Dear friends, today we have with us a very eminent Indian Australian scientist and neurologist, Dr. Sonu Bhaskar. Uh, Dr. Bhaskar has received several national and international awards, and he's also the director of Global Health Neurology Lab in Sydney. Dr. Bhaskar, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Look forward to speaking to you.
Yeah. Dr. Bhaskar, let's begin with your journey. How did you get interested in neurology and tell us about your journey so far?
Thank you, Ms. Jain. Well, I've always been fascinated by the human brain because it's one of the most intricate parts of the body, which, despite being relatively smaller than the rest part, it has an enormous, control over the rest of the body, and many of the aspects of human brain we still don't know. As much as medicine has advanced in treating, diagnosing other conditions in the human body, our understanding of neurological diseases remains suboptimal and far from what we would like to achieve. So there is a huge area, that a repository of knowledge that we are still bereft from. And I think that that's what really inspires me. Much of my work in neuroscience and neurology is to unravel the parts of the human quest to understand the human brain first, and secondly to address treatment and new diagnostics for the human brain conditions.
Yeah, and you are also a physician, so you're a trained doctor as well, and yet you decided to get into the research part of it. Challenging new frontiers and territories. So tell us about that. What made you focus on academics more than the practical application of it?
No, I think one of the beauty of being a physician is that your insights from clinical expertise can drive your curiosity to unravel it. And I do not think that these two are two separate elements of it. In fact, they talk to each other all the time. My role as a clinician and physician has been critical to the questions that I address in the scientific realm, and I think that the complementarity of that is quite important. To go back to the basics, so when I was being trained in medicine and I did my fellowships in neurology and neuroradiology, at that time I had a yearning for some of the questions and clinical challenges, cases that we could not address at that time. And those unknown cases, sometimes they're called cryptogenic and otherwise, these cases were really at the core of my curiosity. And that drove me to kind of, that as some, in looking ahead in the future, how do I leverage the clinical expertise to address and some of these pressing questions? The science and the society would not move forward without the new knowledge, and science provides you that critical approach to addressing some of the pressing challenges in the human brain. And that's the reason that I chose to really merge these two disciplines together, that as a physician, to be at the front line of clinical care of patients with neurological conditions, and as a scientist, addressing some of the pressing questions that you see in the clinic, and then at the global level. So the team that I lead in global health and neurology, takes a very transnational and translational approach. Let me tease that a little bit to for the
Hmm.
sake of audience. Transnational, because I have lived and worked across many continents, in India, in Europe, now in Australasia. I've always realized that some of the greatest challenges in society and in the human brain and in the human diseases, the human condition altogether, cannot be entertained and addressed with a singular focus from a single country. It needs to be
Hmm.
translational, where you bring expertise from people from around the world, you pool the data together, bringing populations which are underrepresented from around the world, and then ask pressing questions and find solutions to those questions. So that's important. I truly believe that global health would be served by bringing expertise from around the world and address these pressing questions. And that's what I do at leadership level across several global health initiatives I lead. Um,
Yeah.
another tangent, coming back to the second part of it, which is translational. So translational is because, while I was training in neurology and in neuroradiology, one of the things I realized that many of the concepts and new understanding of diseases still sits in the clinic. It doesn't really come and make a difference on a global level. So that pain, that how do we bring expertise from a clinic, from one patient, to make sustainable impact around the world, has been very much core of what I do today. So that's what I call it, translational. That you have a knowledge that you have created within a team or within your lab, and now let's just bring that knowledge to, so that this can be accessed by patients and community outside of your realm, outside of your corridor, outside of your hospital, outside in different countries. So, to give you an example, so this part of the work is now where the Brain Clot Bank initiative that I founded was at the core. So, while looking at patients, we found that there are specific about 30 to 40% of acute ischemic stroke patients who have no defined cause or mechanism. So, we don't know what caused the stroke. And there is a classic a patient case that we discussed also, was this a particular patient with who experienced stroke when she was pregnant, and several years later, the patient was still didn't have a defined mechanism of what caused the stroke. So there was a yearning, what is that is causing the stroke? And that is about 30 to 40% of stroke patients. Now, why is it important clinically? The reason it's important is because we don't know the mechanism of stroke. We don't know how to treat these patients. So there is a lot of ambiguity in their treatment options. And that was a pressing question, a clinical question, a societal challenge that I took by the horn, and we really wanted to address it at a very translational level. So I started a study which looked into the patients, the clots. These are the clots that are retrieved after a procedure that we perform to pull the clot out of the particular artery in the brain that blocks the artery. Now, stroke, for people who are not aware of the stroke, so stroke is a condition that is caused by impairment of blood flow into the brain. So when there is a blockage of blood flow into the brain starts starving, and a part of the tissue in the brain starts dying. And the role of clinicians and neurologists is to stop that tissue from dying. And that's what the new approach of treatment in stroke is, to salvage the tissue using two important treatments. One is thrombolysis, which is a drug that you inject in these patients. It clears the clot out, but unfortunately, it cannot be given beyond 4.5 hours of the onset of stroke. The second treatment offers a much more longer time window, which is all the way to 24 hours, and sometimes in select patients more. This particular treatment can be offered where we pull the clot mechanically through a procedure, and then these clots, by the platform that we have developed, is then examined on through multiple platforms, through microscopy and so on and so forth. And then we do correlative studies to see what are the features that can tell us about where these clots are coming from. And that became the ship that really led to that translational discovery and analytical platform that I set up here. And that led to a lot of innovations in the field. And today, that not just it is flagship program in Australia, it's a flagship program around the world. It's the world's first initiative in this particular field. And very recently, we have just helped set up a satellite operation in NHS in Liverpool in UK. So we showed that, again, a translational perspective of how do we use that information that addresses a patient in Australia, but then see that how do we use that information to share that information with patients and clinicians around the world. And that's been very much part of the journey that that I have led so far and would like to contribute in the future.
Yeah, and you created what I believe is the first brain bank in the world.
Yeah,
Is
it's a brain clot biobank, so which is a world's first initiative, and that the world's first initiative in the sense, the reason is, many people ask me that there are many brain banks available in other parts of the world. What
Mm,
makes it very unique, this particular brain biobank, that before 2015, we didn't have the option to, mechanically take the clots out of the brain. So the new treatment option has come only in 2015 and onwards, where we know now, which has now become a standard of care in acute stroke, where we can pull the clot of the brain. Before, we had cancer biobanks, so on and so forth, where once your surgery is performed in these patients, or biopsy is performed, then you store the cancer tissues. You got pancreatic cancer biobank, the brain cancer biobank, so on and so forth. But for stroke in particular, this was absolutely new, novel, and we were the first people to march into this and develop this. And the idea there again was to address a very pressing challenge in stroke, which was about 30 to 40% of those patients who do not have cause or mechanism. Then I said, hey, this is something, it has a forward looking, an important breakthrough in medicine. Why not now share the joys and the fruits out of this particular research with in the real world practice? And that was a genesis of the foundation of Brain Clot Bank.
Yeah, coming back to your brain clot bank, it's really very interesting, Dr. Bhaskar, because from a layman person's perspective, I mean, you just assume that okay, there's a clot, if that causes a stroke. But what you're suggesting is that with each clot, you are actually kind of making a bank of those clots, and those clots then give you an insight into what is actually causing the clots.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a very good question. So what actually happens is that these clots that are coming from, and I say this, that our hypothesis when I started this, and the patient I was talking to you before about, my hypothesis there was that, like any part of the body, every clot carries a signature from where it comes and travels. And in acute stroke, we know that there are a couple of mechanisms which are established mechanism. One of those mechanisms are what we call cardioembolic. Cardioembolic stroke means that these are as cardio means there's something that coming from the heart. So there was a particular clot or a particular part of the tissue that then get dislodged into the brain artery and blocks an artery in the brain and causes stroke. That's called cardioembolic stroke. So these are the stroke that is causing enormous impact on these patients. That's one kind of stroke. The second kind of stroke is called large artery atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis means it's the narrowing of the artery. So when there's a narrowing in the artery in the brain itself, so when the brain artery, the internal carotid artery or middle cerebral artery, when a part of the brain artery gets narrowed, and sometimes it gets completely blocked, when there is a complete interruption of the blood flow, because remember, these arteries are the portals through which the blood flows into the brain. And brain
Sure.
needs this oxygen. Brain cannot survive without oxygen. So when this
Absolutely.
narrowing happens, then it causes an enormous blockage to the brain, and then the tissue starts dying. Now, these are two important mechanisms, stroke. So we know these about two mechanisms. And my hypothesis there was that the rest 40% of stroke patients who do not have a defined mechanism either belongs to this category or the other category. And by looking at these clots, we'll be able to understand or decipher the mechanism from which they came from. And that's precisely what our studies indicated. That many of these patients, which were initially classified as cryptogenic strokes, through our advanced processing and histopathology, immunological analysis, we found that they show us a signature which is more representative of cardioembolic stroke. So cardioembolic. So most of these patients are actually cardioembolic. They have an origin in the heart, and that's where they got dislodged into the brain. Now, if this is established, which much of our work has shown, as it progresses, it will change practice. Why? Because now you know the mechanism of these clots. You know how to treat these patients. You're going to put these patients on anticoagulation or antiplatelet therapy, and that is a remarkable breakthrough for the patients. That's the reason that this particular initiative has gained traction around the world. We now, it's been widely covered around the world because it was quite novel, first of all, and second of all, the putative impact of this in the discipline, not just in stroke, in neurology, but also in cardiovascular diseases in general. Cardiovascular disease mean heart attack and stroke, so on and so forth. So that is an enormous burden in globally, that affects people not just in Australia but in around the world. So it's quite a pressing problem at this moment. I hope that I explained your question.
Yeah, and obviously science has no boundaries, no borders. I mean, it's
That's it,
scientists
exactly.
work in collaboration around the world. And just lastly, I know this is a never-ending question, but there is always this question of the hard questions of consciousness. Whether consciousness is a product of the brain or whether it's independent of the brain. And I know this is an entirely a very big topic, but just your concluding thoughts on that. Is that something that also forms a part of your research? And if you could briefly tell us about your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a great question. So your question is about that. That does brain have a role in the consciousness, human consciousness?
Mm,
Whether that consciousness has what we call neural underpinnings, and that's an area which I am very curious and quite interested to work. And some of my work previously in Europe was in on that tangent. But it's the answer to that question is that we still know very limited. We still know very little about the human brain. And
mm,
now that we have new techniques like positron emission tomography or functional magnetic resonance imaging, these are new imaging technologies that what it does is that for a specific task, so whether you
mm,
ask a patient to laugh or a patient is in grief or a patient has gone through enormous trouble, so on and so forth, you can
mm,
still capture specific parts of the brain that gets aroused. We call,
mm,
stimulation of the parts of the brain by using these imaging techniques. So
mm,
it gives us a window to look at the questions concerning consciousness. However, I still believe we are far from our fully understanding the capabilities of human brain, and let alone the capabilities of human consciousness. And I think we need to do more. I mean, some of the deeper questions in neuroscience has been about what happens when the human brain sleeps, and how do we process memories when we are sleeping? How do we capture and validate the memory capture, so on and so forth?
mm,
What happens to the subconscious processing, and how do the brains process memories from long ahead, and how does it anticipate threats, so on and so forth? So there's an enormous discipline in human brain neurology and neuroscience which remains unanswered. And I think as we move forward, this will be a pressing challenge for clinicians as well as scientists to look into these questions and understand it in a much more comprehensive way.
Dr. Sonu Bhaskar, thank you so much for taking out time and speaking with us today. Thank you so
My,
much.
my pleasure. Wonderful talking to you.